"We've got it, ma'am. Please clear the area." The young paramedic said it without really looking at her, one gloved hand already up and waving her back toward the line of stopped cars, on a bright Tuesday afternoon on the shoulder of the interstate, with smoke standing up thin and pale over a 6-car pileup, and a man dying quietly in a crushed cab 15 feet behind him. The woman he was waving off did not argue. She stepped back exactly one step, the way you step back to let a door swing, and she looked past him at the wreck the way a person looks at a page they have already read. And the only one on that whole sunlit shoulder who saw her go very still inside was a tow truck driver named Hector Salas, who had been to a war himself in a different country than hers, and who would tell people for the rest of his life that he knew right then, the way you know weather is about to break, that the kid in the Navy uniform had just made the worst read of his entire career, because the quiet woman he had called ma'am and waved away was the calmest dangerous person Hector had ever stood next to, and the man in the cab was about to find out why. Her name was Margaret Hale. Everybody who knew her called her Maggie. She was 54 years old, and she wore a faded olive field jacket over a plain gray Henley because the morning had come up cool, and she had been out since dawn, and she kept her ash gray hair, going pale now at the front, pulled back in a low ponytail that a few strands had worked loose from. She had been driving home from the feed store with a sack of fence staples and a coffee gone cold in the cup holder when the traffic ahead of her had done the thing traffic does, a half second before something terrible, the brake lights blooming all at once, the slow crumple of metal carrying back through the air like a sound you feel in your teeth before you hear it. And she had pulled onto the shoulder and put her flashers on and walked toward the smoke before she had finished deciding to, because some part of her had been walking toward smoke for 30 years and did not need to be told twice. She did not run. People always think the ones who know what they are doing run. She walked fast and level, reading as she came, and by the time the young paramedic told her to clear the area, she already knew more about the next 10 minutes than he would learn in the next 10. It is worth telling you how the sentence came to be said at all, because the smallness of it is the point. The first ambulance had pulled up about 90 seconds before Maggie reached the cones, and out of it had come 2 paramedics, and the lead one, a fit, clean-cut young man named Kyle Dressler, 29 years old, 3 years on the truck, good at his job in the way a person is good at a job they have done 1,000 times in the same shape, had taken one look at the scene and started doing what his training told him to do, which was to establish control and keep civilians back. He was not a cruel man. That matters. He was a man who had spent his whole short career being the one who showed up and took charge, the one the frightened crowd parted for, and who had stopped, somewhere in those 3 years, being able to tell the difference between authority and competence, between the uniform that makes a crowd step back and the thing the uniform is supposed to stand for when the floor falls out of the world. When he saw a gray-haired woman in a worn jacket walking toward his scene with a steady look on her face, he filed her instantly under bystander, under liability, under one more person to manage, and he put his hand up and said the thing about clearing the area, and he turned back to the wreck without waiting to see if she obeyed. The dismissal moved off him like heat off asphalt. You could feel it travel. You could feel where it landed, the way Hector by the tow truck glanced at Maggie to see how she would take it. She took it by not taking it. She stepped back her one polite step and kept reading the scene, and that economy of motion, that refusal to be either insulted or impressed, was the first thing about her that did not fit the story the shoulder had decided to tell. If you have ever watched someone good get waved off, watched a scene decide that the quiet, capable person standing at the edge of it does not count, and quietly wished, just once, to see that scene find out exactly how wrong it was, then you already understand why this channel exists, and you might think about subscribing, because the people who stay here are the people who have been the one nobody looked at, and they know, the way Maggie Hale knows, that the loudest, most certain person on the scene is almost never the one you want when a life is leaking out through someone's hands. This is Unspoken Valor. We tell the stories of the ones the room overlooks, right up until the moment it can't anymore. Stay with me, because the moment it couldn't is coming, and it is going to come fast, and the woman in the olive jacket is going to be the only person on that highway who has done this before, in a place far worse than this, with the sky itself trying to kill her while she worked. Let me tell you what the world had decided about Maggie Hale, because the decision is the whole reason this story can happen the way it does. She lived alone on a few acres at the edge of a small town, in a house with a porch that needed paint and a garden that did not, and she kept chickens and a dog and a vegetable patch that fed her and half her road, and the town understood her to be a pleasant private widow type who kept to herself and could be counted on for eggs and not much conversation. That was the verdict, and it had been passed gently, without malice, the way a town decides a quiet person is simple just because they are quiet. The man at the feed store thought she was nice and a little hard to read. A woman who paid cash and loaded her own truck and never lingered. Her neighbors liked her and did not really know her. The county had her on a list somewhere as a retired veteran, which to most of them meant she had filed papers once, and nobody had ever thought to ask what the papers said, because nobody asks a 54-year-old woman in a feed store coat what she did in the Army, the way they would ask a man in a ball cap with a unit on it. They had simply mistaken the surface for the depth, which is the most common mistake there is, and Maggie had let them, because she had learned a long time ago that the space people leave around someone they have decided is harmless is one of the most useful things in the world, and she had decided, the day she came home for good, that she would never need them to know any different. Here is what the shoulder could not see, what Kyle Dressler and the man at the feed store and the whole quiet town all missed. In the inside pocket of Maggie Hale's field jacket, worn smooth from 11 years of being turned over by a thumb, there was a brass challenge coin. One face of it carried a sparrow, a small plain brown bird, wings open, the kind of bird nobody looks at twice, and that will fly straight into a storm to get where it is going. The reverse carried a struck compass rose and 3 letters and a number that would have meant something to perhaps 40 people still alive. She turned it over with her thumb once when the young medic waved her off the way another person might exhale, and folded into her wallet behind her driver's license where no one ever looked because no one ever has reason to look behind a quiet woman's license. There was a combat medic badge she had never once worn on civilian clothes. She had been, before she was the egg lady at the edge of town, a sergeant first class. Her call sign had been Sparrow. She had run a forward aid station that the people who lived through it called the Driftwood because it sat out at the end of everything, the last solid thing before the map went to rumor, and she had spent the worst night of her life and the best work of her life keeping torn apart young people alive on litters in the dirt, while the thing that had torn them walked its fire closer and closer through the dark, and she had come home and put it in a drawer and become a woman who sold eggs on purpose because the quiet was the only thing that had ever let her sleep. Nobody in that town knew any of that. They knew she was kind and private and good with her hands. They had no idea that the calm was not a personality. It was a discipline, learned at a cost most of them would never be asked to pay, and it was about to be the only thing standing between a stranger in a crushed cab and a death the people with the badges would not even have a name for yet. So picture the scene the way Maggie read it in the 4 seconds after Kyle Dressler turned his back on her, because the reading is the thing. The reading is the whole gift. 6 vehicles, tangled across 2 lanes and the shoulder, where a freight rig had come through the back of stopped traffic and shoved everything forward like a hand sweeping a table. The rig itself lay canted half off the road, its cab folded, the driver already out and sitting dazed in the grass. 3 of the passenger cars were the ordinary kind of bad, crumpled, smoking a little, people inside who were hurt and frightened and loud is good. Loud means breathing, loud means a airway that works. One car was worse, a small sedan that had been folded nearly in half against the guardrail, and there was a woman in it whose arm was pinned and bleeding in a way Maggie clocked from 20 feet by the color and the rhythm of it, bright and pulsing, which meant an artery, which meant a clock. And then there was the cab of a passenger truck, a heavy-set man slumped against a deflated airbag, and that one, the one nobody was looking at because he was not screaming, was the one that made the old part of Maggie come awake all the way, because she had spent 2 years learning that the quiet ones are the dying ones, that a man who has stopped making noise has very often stopped for the worst possible reason, and she watched that still chest for 1 full second, and it did not rise, and the bottom dropped out of 11 quiet years all at once. You cannot understand what Maggie Hale did on that shoulder if you do not understand what made her. And because she would never tell you herself, let me tell you. She had grown up in a flat country town where the nearest real hospital was an hour of straight road, and she had joined the Army at 18 for the reason a lot of people from flat country towns join the Army, which is that it was the door that was open. They trained her as a combat medic, and then, because she was the kind of person who notices things and does not panic, they kept her at it and kept moving her forward, closer to where the wounded came from, farther from the clean, bright field hospitals in the rear, until she was the senior medic running the Driftwood, a forward aid station of 9 people whose job was to be the first real care a torn body reached, often in tents, often in the open, often in the dark, often while the thing that had done the tearing was still working its way toward them. She was good at it in a way that frightened the people who worked under her until they learned to trust it. She could walk into a space full of screaming and bleeding, and within about 4 seconds she had sorted every living person in it into an order. Who would die in minutes without her? Who would die in an hour? Who would live no matter what she did? Who was already gone? And she could hold that order in her head and move through it without ever once letting her hands shake, and the hands only shook later, in private, when it was over and there was no one left who needed them steady. They called it triage. She thought of it, privately, as listening. There was a young doctor at a rear hospital who once asked her how she did it, how she walked into the worst thing a human being can look at and came out the other side with a plan instead of a scream. And she had told him the only true answer she had, which was that a bad scene is always trying to tell you the truth, and most people are too loud inside their own fear to hear it, and that her whole job, her only real job, was to be quiet enough to listen. He had not understood, not really. You do not understand it until you have done it, but he had written it down, because it sounded like something a person should remember, and years later, in a clean hospital far from any war, he would find himself standing over a patient who was crashing in a way he could not name, and he would hear Sergeant Hale's voice telling him to be quiet enough to listen, and he would catch the thing he had been missing, and he would save the patient, and he would never get the chance to tell her. That is the thing about Maggie Hale that the town spent 11 years not knowing. She did not just save the people in front of her. She made other people better at saving people, and she did it the same way she did everything, quietly without keeping score, and then she went home and sold eggs. She had run the aid station for the better part of 3 years, and in those years she had built something the people under her did not have a word for either, though some of them tried for the rest of their lives. She had built trust, the specific, total, life and death trust that a frightened 19-year-old puts in the one adult who is not afraid. New medics came to the Driftwood terrified. the way you should be terrified, and within a month of working a shift next to Sergeant Hale, they would have walked into anything if she told them it was the next necessary thing, because she never panicked, and she never lied to them, and she never once asked them to do something she would not do herself, and she always told them exactly what to do in words so simple and so calm that the fear could not get a grip on them. She had a way of stripping an order down to its bones, 5 words, 8 words, never more, because she knew, the way you only know it after you have watched it fail, that a frightened, competent person can do one clear thing perfectly and falls apart if you give them two. Hold pressure here. Count to 100. Watch his lips. Tell me if they change. The young ones learned to live inside those short sentences, and the short sentences kept them alive, and kept the wounded alive, and the whole machine of the driftwood ran on the calm of one woman who had decided, somewhere, that her fear was a private thing she would deal with later, and that the people in front of her would never, ever have to carry it. The night that made her, the night the coin came from, the night the badge was for, the night she never spoke of, was a night the aid station took a convoy's worth of wounded, while the fighting that had made them was still moving across the ground toward the lights of the driftwood. There were more wounded than there were of her people, far more, and the road out had been cut, so there was no evacuation coming, not for hours, which is a span of time that does not sound long until you are inside it holding pressure on something that wants to keep bleeding while you listen to the fire come closer in the dark. She had run that whole night by headlamp and instinct, sorting and resorting as people changed, deciding and deciding again, and she had kept 11 of 14 of the most critical alive until the road opened at dawn and the birds came in, and 3 of them she had not been able to keep, and it was the 3, not the 11, that she carried home in the drawer with the badge she would not wear. You should understand what those hours actually were, because the town never would. They were hours of choosing. Every time a new casualty came in out of the dark on a litter, she had to look at the ones already in front of her and decide, in the time it takes to blink, whose chance just got smaller so that this new one could have a chance at all. And she had to be right, because being wrong meant a specific young person with a specific name died who did not have to, and she had to keep being right for hours with the fire walking closer, and her own hands the only steady thing in the whole screaming dark. There was a moment, late in that night, that she never told anyone about, when a young soldier she had stabilized an hour earlier began to slip again. At the exact moment a new litter came in carrying someone with a worse wound and a better chance, and she had to choose, and she chose the new one, and the first soldier slipped away while her hands were busy somewhere else, and she had heard him go. She had heard the change in the sound he was making, and she had not been able to turn around because turning around would have cost the soldier under her hands the few seconds that were keeping him alive. She made the right call. Everyone who has ever studied that night agrees she made the right call. The math was the math, and she carried that young soldier home anyway, in the drawer with the other 2 and the badge, because being right and being at peace are 2 completely different things, and Maggie Hale had spent 11 years being right and not at peace, which is its own kind of wound, the kind that does not show on any scan, the kind you learn to carry by selling eggs in a quiet town far from anywhere a war could ever reach. One of the 11 she kept, one of the young soldiers she had pulled back from the edge that night, a kid with a wound to the leg that should have killed him, and a name she would know anywhere on earth, was a soldier named Ray Okonkwo. She had knelt on him in the dirt with her whole weight to keep him from bleeding out, and she had talked to him the entire time in a low, steady voice about nothing at all, about a sparrow she used to watch fly out across the fields behind her father's place, a plain little brown bird that would launch itself straight into a hard wind and beat its way through instead of turning back, and she had told Ray Okonkwo to be the sparrow, just keep going through it. The bird does not turn around, and he had kept going, and he had lived. It had not been quick. It had taken most of the night. His pressure had bottomed out twice, and twice she had brought it back, and in the long stretches between the crises, when there was nothing to do but hold the pressure and wait and listen to the fire, she had kept talking because she had learned that a frightened person who can hear a calm voice will hold on longer than a frightened person who cannot. And so she had told him about the sparrow and about her father's fields and about the way the little bird would set its wings and drive straight into a wind that bent the whole world sideways and never quit. And Ray Okonkwo had fixed his whole dying mind on that bird and kept going. He did not remember most of that night. The blood loss took it. He remembered the bird, and he remembered the voice. You will want to remember Ray Okonkwo. He is going to climb out of a patrol car on this highway in about an hour and change everything, and he is going to do it because of a small brown bird. So that was the woman the young paramedic had waved off. That was the woman Kyle Dressler had called ma'am and told to clear the area. She had come home from all of it the way a lot of them come home, which is to say, not all the way. And she had found that the world she came back to was too loud for her now, too full of edges, too likely on any given day to send her hands shaking at a sound, a backfire, a dropped pallet, the particular shriek of a smoke alarm with a dying battery. She had tried things. She had worked for a while on an ambulance in a city, the kind of job people thought she would be glad to have, and she had been good at it, of course she had, and every single shift had cost her something she could not afford to keep paying, because a city ambulance is a parade of other people's worst days, and every one of them knocked on the same door inside her, and one night she had finished a call, a clean save, a man who would walk out fine, and had sat in the back of the rig in the bay with her hands flat on her knees and shaken for 20 minutes where no one could see, and she had understood sitting there that being good at something and being able to survive it are two different things, and that she had reached the end of what she could survive. So she had quit. She had not told them why. They thought she was burned out, which was the word they had, and it was close enough, and she let them have it, the way she let everyone have the easy version. And one autumn she had driven through this county on her way to nowhere in particular, and seen a place for sale, a few acres and a tired house at the edge of a small town, and she had thought about chickens and a garden and a porch, and nobody's worst day but the weather's, and something in her that had not unclenched in 2 years had unclenched just slightly, and she had bought it. She told herself she was choosing the quiet. She did not let herself notice that she had also, without deciding to, chosen a place 10 minutes from a hospital and 20 from a fire station, and that she had quietly kept a real trauma kit behind the seat of her truck the whole time. The good kind, the kind you do not buy unless a piece of you is permanently certain that the worst thing is going to come, someday, for somebody in front of you. She had stood on her new porch that first evening and looked out at the road, and she had felt the old part of her wake up and take a measurement and go quiet again, and she had told herself it meant nothing. The coin went in the jacket, the badge went behind the license, and Maggie Hale became, to everyone in that town, just the quiet woman with the eggs, which was exactly what she had wanted, right up until the Tuesday it wasn't. For 11 years it had been enough. 11 years of feed runs and fence lines and the long, slow turning of a garden. 11 years of eggs left on porches and a dog asleep in the sun. 11 years of a quiet she had begun, cautiously, to believe in. She had a routine. She got up before light and let the chickens out and stood with her coffee while the sky went from gray to gold, and most mornings, in that hour, she was something close to all right. The shaking had mostly stopped. The dreams had mostly gone quiet. She had built, out of eggs and fence staples, and the friendship of a dog, a life she could survive, and she had started to let herself believe that the worst thing was behind her, that she had paid what she owed and could spend the rest of her days in a quiet place, doing the kind of work that did not cost her anything. She was wrong about that, but it was a forgivable kind of wrong, the kind a person earns the right to be after 11 years of being right. The worst thing was not behind her. It was coming up the interstate at 70 miles an hour behind a set of brakes that should have been replaced 2 services ago, and it was going to fold 6 cars together on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while she drove home with fence staples and cold coffee, and she was going to be the only person on that road who had ever seen its like before. So when Kyle Dressler waved her off and turned his back and went to do his job, Maggie Hale stood at the edge of his scene for exactly 1 more second, the way she always took 1 more second, and she let the listening part of her finish its work. And what it told her, in that second, was a list, in order, the way it always gave her a list. The woman against the guardrail with the arm, minutes. The man in the cab who had stopped breathing, less than that, maybe none. The loud ones in the smoking cars, time, they have time, leave them. They are telling you they are fine by being loud. And under the list, the cold thing that always came with it, the thing 11 years of porch and eggs had never quite put to sleep. Somebody is going to die on this road in the next 90 seconds if the only person here who knows what to do keeps politely standing behind the cones. And Maggie Hale stopped being the egg lady, and the sergeant came back into her body like a light coming on, and she moved. There is a thing that happens to a certain kind of person in the first second of a catastrophe, and it is the opposite of what happens to everyone else. Everyone else gets slower and louder inside. The fear floods in, and the world narrows, and the mind starts shouting questions it cannot answer. Maggie got faster and quieter. The fear was there. The fear is always there. She had simply spent 30 years learning to set it down on a shelf where it could not reach her hands, and she set it down now, in the time it took to step around the cone, and what was left when the fear was gone was a cold, clean clarity that saw the whole problem at once, in tiers, in an order. She did not feel brave. People always assume the brave ones feel brave. She felt mostly like a machine that had been switched on after a long sleep, every old subroutine waking up and reporting in, and the first thing the machine knew, before anything else, was that the next 90 seconds would decide how many of the people on this road were alive at sundown, and that she was the only one here who knew it. She went straight past Kyle Dressler, not around the long way, not asking, past him, fast, with the flat, unhurried speed of someone who has decided and is not going to discuss it, and she said over her shoulder, not unkind, "Your guy in the cab isn't breathing. I've got him." And she was at the crushed door before Kyle's brain had finished cataloging the fact that a civilian had just walked into his scene. He turned and he started to say something, the something a man says when his authority has been stepped around. "Hey, ma'am, I need you to." And then he saw her reach into the cab and put 2 fingers to the man's throat and tilt her head in that particular listening way, and something about the way she did it, the absolute lack of hesitation, the way her hands already knew where they were going, made the protest die in his mouth. Kyle Dressler had been on 3 years of calls, and he had never once seen anyone touch a patient like that. Like the patient was a sentence she was reading and not a problem she was bracing herself to solve. He came up behind her. He said, "Ma'am, what are you doing? I need you to step back." And Maggie Hale, not turning around, said 5 words that he would replay for the rest of his life. "He's got attention pneumo." And Kyle, who knew those words, who had learned those words in a classroom and filed them under things you might see someday, felt the ground tilt a little under him because the gray-haired woman in the feed store jacket had just named, in under 2 seconds, a thing he was not sure he would have caught in 2 minutes. If you've made it this far into Maggie's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. A tension pneumothorax is the kind of thing that kills the quiet way, And that is exactly why it is so dangerous in a loud scene full of screaming people, because the screaming pulls every eye and every hand toward the people who are going to be fine and away from the one person who has gone silent because the air is being squeezed out of him from the inside. Here is what it is, in the only words that matter. His chest had been crushed against the wheel, a lung had been punctured, and air was leaking out of it with every breath and filling the space around it instead. And that trapped air had nowhere to go, so it built and pressed, squeezing not just the hurt lung, but the good lung and the heart itself, folding the whole middle of him shut like a fist closing. The terrible thing, the thing that makes it a quiet killer, is that from the outside the man just looks like he is fading, going pale and slack and still until the pressure stops his heart, and unless someone knows, really knows, in their hands and not just their head, that the answer is to put a needle through the chest wall and let that trapped air hiss out and let the fist open, the man simply dies, looking the whole time like a man who is merely unconscious. Kyle Dressler knew the noun, Maggie Hale knew the verb, and the difference between the noun and the verb was about to be measured in the life of a stranger on a sunny Tuesday on the shoulder of a road in 90 seconds. She had the kit before he understood she had moved. Not his kit, her kit, the good one from behind the seat of her truck, because she had sent Hector for it with 4 words the second she touched the man's throat. Olive jacket, behind the seat, go. And Hector Salas, who had spent a war learning to recognize the voice that means do it now and ask never, had already been running before she finished the sentence and was back with the bag in under a minute. And that minute was a minute the man could not have spared if she had waited for anyone to fetch anything the polite way. She had the man's shirt open. She had her fingers walking down his ribs, counting, finding the space, the second one down, the line under the collarbone, the exact spot she had found on chests in the dark 100 times, and her hands did not hesitate and did not shake. And Kyle Dressler crouched beside her now, not to stop her but to watch, because some animal part of him had understood faster than his pride could that he was in the presence of something he had better learn from while he had the chance. She uncapped the catheter. She said to the man who could not hear her, the way she always talked to them, whether they could hear her or not, "All right, here we go. Stay with me." And she put the needle in over the rib, steady and sure, into the trapped air, and there was a hiss, a long, awful, beautiful hiss, the sound of a fist unclenching, and the man's chest, which had not risen in over a minute, fell, and then, a moment later, on its own, rose. It is the detail no one on that shoulder ever forgot. The man took a breath. A real one, ragged and wet and his own, and then another, and the gray began to go out of his face, and Kyle Dressler made a sound, a small, involuntary sound, because he had just watched a woman he had waved off as a bystander reach into a dying man and turn the dying off like a switch, with a needle, in the time it had taken him to argue with her about whether she should be allowed to. And Maggie Hale did not look up, and did not say anything to Kyle, and did not have one single flicker of "I told you so" anywhere in her body, because she was already gone, already moving, already 3 steps toward the woman against the guardrail with the bleeding arm, because the man in the cab was breathing now, and breathing was the win, and the win was over, and there was a clock running on the next one. "Watch his chest," she said to Kyle as she went. 4 words, an order, and Kyle Dressler, 3 years on the truck, the authority on this scene, the man who had told her to clear the area 90 seconds ago, said, "Yes, ma'am," and watched the man's chest, and did exactly what the egg lady told him. The woman against the guardrail was named Dana Boyd, though Maggie would not learn that for a while, for now she was a 35-year-old woman with brown hair and a face going the particular gray-white of someone losing blood fast, and an arm pinned in the folded door with bright red coming out of it in a rhythm that matched her heart, which is the rhythm that means an artery, which is the rhythm that means you have minutes and not many of them. Dana was awake, which was bad, because awake meant she could feel it and see it, and she was making the high, thin sound of a person watching their own blood leave them and not understanding why no one is stopping it. The second paramedic from the truck was crouched near her, a young woman doing her honest best, holding a wad of gauze against the wound and pressing. And pressing is not nothing. Pressing is the right first instinct, but the bleed was higher than the gauze could reach and faster than pressure could hold, and the young medic's face had the particular wide stillness of a person who is doing the only thing she knows how to do and can see that it is not working and does not know what comes after it. Maggie came down beside her fast and low and did not take over in the way that shames a person, did not knock her hands away, but slid in next to her and said, calm and certain, "You're doing good. Keep that pressure. I'm going higher." And she reached past the gauze and the door and got her hand around the woman's upper arm, well above the wound where the artery runs close to the bone, and you can shut the whole limb down if you know where to push. And she pushed, hard, with the heel of her hand on the exact spot, and the bright pulsing slowed. But a hand cannot hold a pressure point forever, and Maggie had a whole scene still to run, so she did the thing she had done in the dirt 100 times and reached into the kit and came out with a tourniquet, the real kind, the strap and the windlass, and she got it around Dana Boyd's arm high and tight above the wound, and she cranked the windlass, turning the little bar that twists the strap down until the strap is biting and the limb below it goes quiet, and Dana cried out, because a tourniquet hurts. It is supposed to hurt. The hurt is the sound of it working. And Maggie said to her, low in the voice, I know it hurts. That is it, doing its job. You are going to keep this arm, and you are going to keep your life. And the price of both of those is that this is going to hurt for a while. Can you pay that? Look at me. Can you pay that? And Dana Boyd, who an instant before had been drowning in her own panic, found a pair of steady gray-green eyes locked on hers and a voice that was treating her not like a victim, but like a person being asked a fair question. And she said through her teeth, yes. And Maggie said, good. That is the whole game. You just keep going through it. And she cranked the windlass one more turn, and the bleeding stopped, fully stopped, the way it does when someone who knows exactly what they are doing puts a tourniquet on exactly right. And the young medic beside her let out a breath she had been holding for a minute and a half and looked at Maggie the way you look at someone who has just shown you the move you are going to spend the rest of your career trying to learn. She wrote the time on Dana's forehead with a marker from the kit. 2 letters and 4 numbers, the time the tourniquet went on, because the surgeons downstream would need to know, because a tourniquet is a clock of its own, and the people who would take it off later in a clean, bright room would need to know exactly how long the arm had been without blood, and writing the time on the skin is the kind of thing you only do if you were trained in a place where the patient might pass through 6 sets of hands before they reached a surgeon, and every set of hands needed to be told the truth at a glance. The young medic watched her write it and understood in that small gesture more about who this woman was than anything that had been said out loud, because civilians do not write tourniquet times on foreheads. Soldiers do. People who have handed wounded up a chain in the dark do. And the young medic, whose name was Priya and who would tell this story at every dinner table for the rest of her life, felt the whole shape of the afternoon rearrange around the gray-haired woman in the olive jacket, and stopped being a paramedic with a bystander in her way and started being, gratefully, a pair of hands for the sergeant to use. And here is where Kyle Dressler entered the worst 10 minutes of his life, and the best. Though it would take him months to understand they were the same minutes. He had watched her decompress the chest. He had watched her tourniquet the arm. He was, by every credential on that shoulder, the medical authority on the scene, and in the space of 2 minutes he had been demoted by nothing but the evidence of his own eyes to a junior on a line being run by someone better. And the remarkable thing, the thing that would decide whether Kyle Dressler was going to be a good man or merely a competent one, was what he did with that. A smaller man would have fought it. A smaller man would have needed, even then, to be in charge, would have pulled rank, would have radioed in that a civilian was interfering with his scene, would have let a stranger die rather than be saved by the wrong person. Kyle Dressler stood in the middle of his own scene and felt the whole story he had told himself about. Who knew what come apart in his hands, and he had the grace, and this is the beginning of his grace, to be horrified by how close he had come to waving away the only person who could save these people rather than to defend the wave. He came up beside Maggie at the guardrail and he said, and it cost him, "What do you need? Tell me what you need, and I will do it." And Maggie Hale, not slowing down, looked at him for the first time, really looked at him, 1/2 of 1 second, and saw a young man choosing, in real time, to be useful instead of proud, and she gave him the thing she gave everyone she decided to trust, which was a job, stripped to the bone. "You are good with the loud ones," she said. "Go to the 3 smoking cars. Anybody screaming is breathing. Leave them be. Just get them out and sit them on the grass over there, upwind. Anybody who is quiet, anybody who has gone still, you yell my name and you point. Quiet is the danger. Go." And Kyle Dressler went and did exactly that, and for the rest of that scene he was not the lead paramedic. He was the best junior medic Maggie Hale had worked with in 11 years, because he turned out to be teachable, which is rarer and more valuable than being talented, and he ran the loud ones and the walking wounded, and he sat them on the grass and counted them, and twice he yelled, "Hale," and pointed at someone who had gone quiet, and twice Maggie was there in 3 steps doing the thing, and both of those people lived who might not have, and Kyle Dressler would carry those 2 people in him for the rest of his life, the way Maggie carried her 3, except his 2 had lived, because a gray-haired stranger had taught him in 90 seconds that the quiet ones are the dying ones, and he had listened. What Maggie did in the next 15 minutes, she did the way she had run the driftwood, which is to say she turned a catastrophe into a sequence. There is no panic in a sequence. There is only the next necessary thing, and then the next. She had the man in the cab breathing, with Kyle's eyes on his chest. She had Dana Boyd's arm shut down with a tourniquet, and the time written on her skin. She had Priya now working as her right hand, fetching and holding and learning. She had Kyle running the loud ones to the grass. She had Hector Salas, the tow driver, who had stopped being a tow driver the second he heard the voice and had become instantly the best soldier she had, doing the heavy work, peeling a door, steadying a seat, lifting when she said lift, holding when she said hold, his own old training coming up his spine like warmth coming back into a cold limb, his hands steady, his face set, exactly the man he had been at 22 and had spent 20 years trying not to remember he could be, and she moved through it all in that flat, unhurried way, reading each person as she reached them, sorting and resorting, and the speed of it, the sheer unhesitating speed, was the thing that told everyone watching that whatever they had thought the gray-haired woman was, they had been wrong. She triaged. This is the part the survivors would describe for the rest of their lives, because it did not look like anything they understood, and it saved nearly all of them. As people came out of the wrecks, hurt and dazed and bleeding, Maggie sorted them, by sight, in seconds, the listening way, into an order nobody had told her to make, and nobody else on that shoulder could have made. She kept for herself the worst of them, the ones who would die without her in the next minutes, and she handed the rest out in single jobs to the people she had decided could be trusted with one clear thing each, because a frightened, competent person can do one clear thing perfectly and falls apart if you give them two. She had Priya holding a head still on a man whose neck she did not like the look of. She had Kyle on the loud ones. She had Hector lifting. She had the freight driver, who had been sitting useless and shaking in the grass, given the simplest possible task. You are not hurt bad. Good. Then you are going to be useful. See that woman with the arm? You sit with her. You hold her good hand and you talk to her and you do not let her be alone. That is your job. Do not move from it. Because Maggie Hale believed all the way down that there is a job for everyone in a disaster, even the man who caused it, and that giving a shaking person a small, clear thing to do is sometimes the kindest and most useful thing you can hand them. And the freight driver took the woman's hand and held it and talked to her, and it steadied them both, and it was the only thing that man did right all day, and Maggie gave him the chance to do it. And then she did the thing that no one else on that shoulder would have done, the thing that came from a place none of them had been, which was that in the middle of running the whole scene, she stopped for 1 second and counted. Not the people she could see. She counted the wrecks, 6 vehicles. She counted the people that went with 6 vehicles, the way you do an accident, 2 here and 1 there, and the driver of the rig, and the number she got from the people did not match the number she expected from the vehicles, and a cold, quiet alarm went off in the back of her mind, the one that had kept whole convoys alive, the one that says you are missing one. There is one you have not found, and most people would have ignored it because most people, in the roar of a scene like that, cannot hear the quiet alarm over their own adrenaline. Maggie heard it. She always heard it, and she lifted her head and scanned past the wrecks, past the guardrail, out across the grassy median where the long green grass grew tall, and she saw 50 feet out, where no one was looking because it was not where the wrecks were, a glint of metal in the weeds, the back end of a small car that had been knocked clean off the road and down into the median, and was sitting nose down in the tall grass where the whole rest of the scene had driven right past it. And she said, to no one, to herself, in a voice 11 years old, "There is another one," and she went. I want to stop here at the exact center of this and tell you the thing the afternoon was actually about, because you have been watching one story and it is about to become a different one. You have been watching a bystander turn out to be a combat medic. That is the reveal you came for, and it is true, and it is coming all the way out in a little while when a patrol car stops on this highway and a young state trooper climbs out and recognizes a face he last saw upside down in the dark. But that is the smaller of the two true things, and the larger one starts right here, in the tall grass of the median, with the car nobody counted because of all the questions running through Maggie Hale's mind as she waded out toward that hidden car, the one that would not go away, the one her trained and listening mind had already gone to without her permission, was the colder one, the one she knew from a place where a disaster is almost never an accident all the way down. How does a loaded freight rig come through the back of stopped daytime traffic on a clear, dry road with good sight lines and not stop? She had seen the rig. She had seen the cab. She had, without quite deciding to, read the marks on the road on her way in, the way you read everything when a piece of you never stops reading, and the marks were wrong. There were not enough of them. A rig that tries to stop and cannot leaves a long story written in rubber on the asphalt. The desperate braking, the swerve, the fight. This rig had left almost nothing, which meant the driver had barely braked at all, which meant either he had not been looking or he could not stop. And underneath that, colder still, a clear, dry Tuesday, good road, stop traffic visible for a quarter mile, and a loaded rig just walks straight through it without slowing. That is not an accident the way a patch of ice is an accident. Something had put that rig on that road in that condition, and whatever it was, it had been willing to send 40 tons down an interstate in a state it should never have left the yard in. The wreck was not the crime, it was the consequence. And the only person on that shoulder positioned to find the crime was the woman everyone had agreed was just a bystander. She did not chase it yet. That is the discipline. A lesser person, a more ordinary hero, would have let the wrongness of it pull them off the line, would have walked over to look at the brakes while a person in the median grass quietly stopped breathing. Maggie Hale filed the question. She put it on the same shelf where she put her own fear, and she kept moving toward the hidden car because the person in that car was the next necessary thing, and the question was not, and the entire reason she was the kind of person who could eventually solve a thing like the freight company was that she could refuse to solve it 1 second before the wounded were safe. The question of why would keep. The person would not. So she waded the last of the way into the tall grass, and she got to the car, and she looked in the window, and her stomach dropped, because there was a man in there, a man in his 60s slumped over the wheel, and he was alive. She could see his chest moving, shallow and slow, and he had been sitting there 50 feet from a scene swarming with paramedics for somewhere between 8 and 10 minutes, while every trained responder on that road tended the wrecks they could see and never once counted the cars and came up one short. The man in the hidden car was named, she would learn later, Walter Pruitt, and he was 63 years old, and he had been the second car back when the rig came through, and the impact had launched his little sedan off the road and down into the median where the tall grass had closed over it like water over a stone, and he had a head injury and a chest that was filling slowly and a level of consciousness that was sliding, and he was, of every person on that whole road, the one closest to dying, and he was the one no one had found, because he was quiet, and because he was not where the wrecks were, and because finding him required someone to do arithmetic in the middle of chaos and trust the answer. Maggie got the door open. She got her hands on him, read him in the 4 seconds, and understood that she now had 2 critical patients, the man in the cab and this man in the grass, in 2 different places, 50 feet apart, with one of her, and that she was going to have to do the hardest thing in all of triage, which is to divide yourself, to leave a dying person to hold a dying person, to bet that the one you leave will keep breathing the length of time it takes you to stabilize the one you are with, and to be right about that bet, because being wrong meant a name on a stone. This is the calculus the town never knew she could do. She did it in her head in the grass, fast and cold, and she made her bets, and she started moving people. She did not carry Walter Pruitt out herself, because you do not move a man with a head and chest injury by dragging him through grass, and because she did not have to, because she had spent the last 10 minutes building, without anyone quite noticing, a team. She turned and she put 2 fingers in her mouth and she whistled, one short hard note that cut across the whole scene, the note that means on me, now, and Hector Salas looked up from a door he was peeling and came at a run, and Kyle Dressler looked up from the grass and came, and Priya came, and Maggie laid it out in the short sentences, 1 job each. Backboard from the truck. We log roll him, we keep the neck straight, we move him as 1 piece on my count, not before. And the 4 of them, a tow driver and 2 paramedics and a woman in a feed store jacket, knelt in the tall grass around a stranger and moved him the way Maggie said, as 1 piece, on her count, and they carried him up out of the median to the flat shoulder where she could work him, and the whole time she was talking to Walter Pruitt in the low, steady voice, telling him about the grass and the sun and the sparrow, telling him to keep going through it. The bird does not turn around, even though Walter Pruitt could not hear a word of it, because she had learned that you talk to them anyway, you always talk to them anyway, because some part of a person hears you even when the rest has gone, and because the talking is as much for the team's hands as for the patient's ears, the calm in the voice traveling out into all of them and Kay, keeping their hands steady too. By the time they had Walter Pruitt on the shoulder and Maggie had a chest needle in him and his breathing evened and the worst of his slide arrested, the second and third ambulances had arrived, and the volunteer fire crew, and the road behind the wreck had backed up a mile, and the scene had become the kind of organized chaos that looks like help and mostly is. And the new responders did the thing that frightened people in uniforms do when they arrive at a scene already being run well by someone who does not look like an authority, which is they tried for a few minutes to take it over from her. A fire lieutenant, a decent man, came up and started directing, started pulling patients toward ambulances in the wrong order, the worst looking first, which is the wrong order, which is exactly backward, because the worst looking are often the loud ones and the truly dying are the quiet ones, and he reached for Dana Boyd, who was stable now and loud with pain, to load her ahead of Walter Pruitt, who was silent and dying, and Maggie had to stop him. Picture the geometry of it for a second, because the geometry is the whole problem. On one side, the fire lieutenant, a man in turnout gear, a radio on his shoulder, a department behind him, every visible marker of the person you are supposed to listen to in a disaster. On the other side, Maggie Hale, a woman in a faded olive jacket with another person's blood drying on her hands, no uniform, no badge anyone could read, no rank anyone could see, the single most capable person on the road and the one who looked least like it. The lieutenant was not a bad man, and he was not being arrogant. He was doing exactly what his training told him to do, which was to take charge, and his training had no way of telling him that the person already in charge, the woman who looked like she had wandered over from a farm, had forgotten more about mass casualty triage than his whole department had ever learned. And here is where Kyle Dressler did the first fully redeeming thing of his afternoon, because the fire lieutenant was not going to take orders from a woman in a barn coat. But Kyle had been on this line for 20 minutes now, learning, a beat behind, watching her work, and somewhere in those 20 minutes the scales had come off his eyes completely, and so when the lieutenant started loading the wrong patient, it was Kyle Dressler, the lead paramedic, the man with the credential the lieutenant would respect, who stepped in and said, in the voice that men like the lieutenant do obey, "Stop. You take your orders from her. She knows what this is and you don't, and neither do I. She's running this triage." And he pointed at the woman in the olive jacket, and the fire lieutenant looked at the paramedic pointing at the bystander, and something in the geometry of the moment rearranged, and he said, "Who is she?" And Kyle Dressler, who did not know the answer, who would not know the answer for another 10 minutes, said the truest thing he had, which was, "I don't know, but she just decompressed 2 chests and put on the only tourniquet that held and found the guy you all drove past. So she's in charge. What do you need from him?" And he turned to Maggie, and Maggie, not slowing down, not gloating, not even really looking up, said, "Walter first, the quiet one, then the arm. I'll point. Trust the pointing." And the loading order reversed, and Walter Pruitt went into the next ambulance, and lives that would otherwise have ended that afternoon did not. You should know what it cost Kyle to say that, because the story is fair to him, or it is not worth telling. Every word of "she knows what this is and you don't and neither do I" was a brick out of the wall he had spent 3 years building, and he said it anyway, out loud, in front of his own partner and a fire crew, and the same stretch of road where he had waved her off 20 minutes before, and he did it because somewhere under the uniform he was, in fact, a young man who cared more about the people on the asphalt than about being right, and the afternoon had finally handed him a problem big enough to make him choose between the two. He chose the people. That is the whole arc of Kyle Dressler, and it happens right here on the shoulder of a highway, beside an ambulance, and it is quiet and almost nobody notices it because everybody is watching the woman. The helicopter came for Walter Pruitt because his head injury needed a trauma center an hour away by road and 12 minutes by air, and a flat closed stretch of the interstate made a landing zone, and the volunteer firefighters knew how to set one even if they had been loading patients wrong, and a plain white medical helicopter came down out of the clear blue sky in a hurricane of rotor wash that flattened the median grass and tore at everyone's clothes, and the flight crew came out at a crouch with their stretcher, and they were good. They were a real critical care crew, and they came to Walter Pruitt expecting to find a man who had been sitting in a median for 20 minutes with a head and chest injury and no care, and they found instead a man with a decompressed chest and an airway managed and an IV line started and a handoff report waiting for them, delivered in the clipped, complete shorthand of someone who has handed patients to flight crews 100 times. Every number they needed, in order, no wasted word. And the flight paramedic, a woman who had seen a great deal, looked at the gray-haired civilian giving her the report and said, "Who packaged this patient?" And Maggie said, "I did." And the flight paramedic looked at the chest seal and the line and the written time on the skin and said quietly, the first person all day to say it out loud, "Where did you train?" And Maggie Hale, loading a stranger onto a helicopter she had kept alive long enough to need one, said, "A while ago, far away. It doesn't matter. He's got a slow bleed on the left. Watch it on the way." And the flight crew took Walter Pruitt up into the blue, and he lived, and the flight paramedics spent the whole 12-minute flight thinking about the woman on the shoulder who had done her job for her before she got there. For a while after the helicopter lifted, the scene was all motion, and Maggie was the still point in the middle of it. The way she had been the still point in the tent, she did not stop. She went back down the line she had built, and she read every person on it again, because a scene is not safe when the loud part ends. A scene is safe when someone has checked every quiet face twice, and she checked them twice. She found a man sitting calmly against a tire who told her he was fine, and she crouched and looked at his eyes and the color of his nail beds and did not believe him, and she was right not to, because his belly was filling, and he was the kind of quiet that comes before the bad kind of quiet, and she flagged him and got him to the next ambulance ahead of 3 people who looked worse and were not. She found a young woman hyperventilating who everyone had written off as hysterical, and she knelt and put a steady hand on her shoulder and got her breathing slowed in 30 seconds, not because the woman was faking, but because panic is its own emergency and a calm voice is its only treatment. And the woman, who would have been left shaking in the grass on anyone else's scene, was walking and talking and helping hand out blankets 10 minutes later, because one person had treated her fear like a real thing and not a nuisance. And she went back to the man in the cab, the very first one, Tom, the one whose chest she had decompressed in 90 seconds at the start of all of it. And she checked the needle and listened to his breathing and found it good, found him holding, and she put her hand flat on his shoulder for 1 second, the way she did, and she told him, though he could not hear her, "You held on. Good man. Almost home." And then she straightened up and looked for the next necessary thing, and there was always a next necessary thing, right up until there wasn't. Right up until the moment she lifted her head and found that the line was holding, every person on it accounted for. Every quiet face checked twice, the worst of it over, and she allowed herself, for the first time in 40 minutes, half of one breath that was not in service of someone else's, and stood there in the settling quiet with 2 coins in her pocket, and the long habit of grief sitting down beside her the way it always did when the work finally let go of her hands. There is a thing I have not told you yet, and I have saved it for here, because Maggie would have saved it for here, because it is the thing underneath all the rest of it. The reason her hands knew the chest and the bird and the tourniquet so well that she could do them in her sleep, the reason she carried the coin, the 3 she lost on the worst night, the 3 she could not keep, the 3 that rode home in the drawer with the badge she would not wear. One of them had a name she could not say out loud for 9 years, a young soldier named Wes Tanner, the corporal who slipped away in the dark while her hands were busy on someone with a better chance, the one whose going she heard and could not turn around for. She had been right to choose the other one. The math was the math. Everyone agreed, and she had carried Wes Tanner every day since, the specific weight of him, the sound he made when he went, the back she could not turn, and she had never once let herself off the hook for the thing she had done right, because being right and being at peace are 2 different countries, and she had been a citizen of the first one and an exile from the second for 9 long years. About 2 years after the night, before she came to the town, before the eggs, a letter had found her. It had been forwarded 3 times, and it was soft at the creases from travel, and it was from a woman named Carol Tanner, who was Wes Tanner's mother, and Maggie had held that envelope for a long time before she opened it, because she knew what was in it, she thought. She knew it would be the grief of a mother who had been told that her son died while the medic in charge was saving someone else, and she had braced herself to be hated, had almost wanted it, had thought that maybe being hated by Wes Tanner's mother was a debt she owed and could at least pay. And then she had opened it, and it was not that. It was the opposite of that. Carol Tanner had written to her because the soldier whose life Maggie had chosen over her son's, the one she saved with the seconds Wes did not get, had come home and had found Carol Tanner and had told her, weeping, that he was alive because of a decision a sergeant made in the dark, a decision that had cost another mother her son, and that he carried it, and that he would spend his life trying to be worth it. And Carol Tanner had written to Maggie Hale to tell her something that Maggie had needed to hear for 2 years and had not known she would ever hear. And the letter is the reason Maggie could keep going, and I am going to tell you what it said, because Maggie would want you to have it. Carol Tanner wrote, "They told me how it was. They told me you had 2 boys and seconds for one. I have spent a long time being angry at God and at the war and for a while at you, and I want you to know that I am done being angry at you, because I have thought about it every day, and I understand now that you did not choose against my Wesley. You chose for a living boy you could still reach. That is not the same thing, and it took me 2 years to know the difference, and I needed you to know that I know it. My son did not die because you failed him. My son died in a place where there were too many wounded and not enough of you, and in that place you did the hardest thing a person can do, which is to keep deciding and to keep being right when being right breaks your own heart. I have learned what you are. You are the person who teaches the terrified how to keep going through the wind. Wesley wrote me about you once. He said there was a sergeant who was not afraid, and that being near her made him less afraid, and that is the last gift my son got in this world, to be less afraid at the end, and you gave it to him. So I am sending you the thing he carried. He would want you to have it. Carry it with yours. And please, Margaret, if you can hear an old woman who has made her peace, lay your own burden down some of the way I have laid mine. You were never his killer. You were the last kind face he saw, and you told him about a bird. And folded into that letter, taped to the bottom of the page, there had been a coin. Wes Tanner's coin. The same coin, the sparrow and the compass rose. The one the driftwood gave its own. The one every soldier who had served under Maggie carried. The bird that flies into the wind. Carol Tanner had sent her dead son's challenge coin to the woman who had not been able to save him, and had told her to carry it with her own, and Maggie Hale had sat on the floor of an apartment she barely remembered now, and held 2 brass coins in her hand, and wept for the first time since the night, really wept, the kind that comes up from somewhere underneath the place where you keep your discipline, and she had not laid the burden all the way down, because you do not, because some things you carry the rest of the way no matter what anyone gives you permission to do. But she had laid it down some of the way Carol asked, and she had been able, after that, to imagine a quiet house and a garden and a life she could survive. The coins went in her pocket together, Wes Tanner's and hers, the bird, and they had been in her pocket on the shoulder of the interstate, both of them, when she put the needle in a stranger's chest and gave a frightened woman a fair question and waded into the tall grass after a man nobody had counted. She had two birds in her pocket the whole time. She always did. And it was right then, as the helicopter lifted off and the rotor wash died and the grass settled and the noise of it faded up into the sky, that a state police cruiser that had been fighting its way up the block shoulder finally reached the scene, and the trooper inside it parked and got out and started walking up toward the wreck to take command of his accident, the way a trooper does, and he was a young man, athletic, in a plain dark uniform, and he was scanning the scene the way you scan a scene, counting vehicles, looking for the person in charge, and his eyes moved across the shoulder, across the ambulances, across the firefighters, and landed on a gray-haired woman in a faded olive jacket who was kneeling beside a man in a crushed cab, and the trooper stopped walking. He just stopped. In the middle of his own scene, with his radio chattering on his shoulder, Sergeant Ray Okonkwo of the state police stopped dead because he knew that profile. He knew the set of those shoulders. He knew the way you know a thing in your body before your mind catches up, the particular tilt of that head, the listening tilt, the head tilted exactly that way over a wounded man, and 11 years and 1,000 miles fell away from underneath him all at once, and Ray Okonkwo was 19 years old again and bleeding out in the dirt in the dark with the fire coming closer, and a calm voice was telling him about a little brown bird that flies straight into the wind and does not turn around. He walked toward her slowly, the way you walk toward something you are afraid will not be real if you go too fast. The scene went on around him. The radios and the engines and the hurt people and the firefighters coiling hose, the ordinary and different machinery of an emergency continuing, and Ray Okonkwo crossed the shoulder through all of it like a man crossing water, and he stopped a few feet from where Maggie knelt, and she felt him there, the way she felt everything, and she looked up, and she saw his face, and for 1 second the sergeant's mask slipped on Maggie Hale, and something underneath it moved, because she knew that face too. She had last seen that face gray and slack and nearly gone, upside down in the light of a headlamp, on the worst night of her life, and she had told it about a sparrow, and here it was, 11 years later, healed and grown and whole, and wearing the uniform of a state trooper, looking down at her with tears already standing in its eyes, and Maggie Hale, who did not show things, who had not shown a thing on her face in front of strangers in 30 years, felt her own throat close. Ray Okonkwo did not say her name. He came to attention. Right there on the shoulder of the interstate, in front of the firefighters and the paramedics and the hurt and the dazed, a state police sergeant straightened his spine and squared his shoulders and brought his heels together, and he raised his right hand in a slow and perfect salute, the kind you do not give to a civilian, the kind that means something, and he held it, and his voice when it came was thick and steady at the same time, and he said one word first, the word that was a rank, and then the word that was a name that was not a name, the call sign, and what he said was, Sergeant Hale. And then, lower, just for her, the old word, the bird, sparrow. And he held the salute, and the whole shoulder of the road went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when something true happens in it, because everyone there understood, without being told, that they had just watched something they did not have the rank to understand. and that the gray-haired woman in the barn coat that the young paramedic had waved off the scene 40 minutes ago was somebody from a world the rest of them only saw in pieces on the news, and that the young trooper saluting her was not performing, was not being dramatic, was a man paying a debt that could not be paid, in the only currency the moment had. Kyle Dressler, standing 10 feet away with another man's blood on his hands, felt the bottom drop out of every assumption he had walked onto that scene with, and he would tell people, later, that the worst and best moment of his whole life was the moment he watched a state trooper salute the woman he had told to clear the area and understood, all at once and far too late, exactly who he had waved away. Maggie Hale stood up. She did it slowly because her knees were not 19 anymore, and because the man in the cab was stable now, and there was a half second she could spare, and she stood and she faced Ray Okonkwo, and her hand went, without her deciding it, into the inside pocket of her field jacket, and her thumb found the coin, the sparrow, the bird that flies into the wind, the way it always found the coin when something was too big to hold any other way, and she looked at the boy she had kept alive in the dark, the man he had become, and she returned his salute. She did not say much. She never said much. She brought her own hand up, steady, and she held it for the length of his, and then she dropped it, and she said, in the flat, quiet voice that the whole road was straining to hear, "You grew up good, Ray." And that was all. That was the entire speech. You grew up good, Ray. And Ray Okonkwo's careful trooper's composure broke clean in half, and he crossed the last few feet, and he put his arms around the woman who had saved his life, right there in front of his whole scene. And Maggie Hale, who did not get held, who had not let anyone hold her in longer than she would admit, stood inside the arms of the soldier she had kept, and let herself be held for exactly 3 seconds, and then she patted his back twice, the way you do, and she stepped back, because there was still a man in a cab, and Dana Boyd's arm, and a whole scene to close out, and the work was not done, and the work is never done, and that is the thing about Maggie Hale, that even inside the one pure moment of vindication she would ever get, the moment the road found out who she was, her first complete thought after 3 seconds was about getting back to the next necessary thing. She did not gloat. I want to be clear about that, because the cheap version of this story is the one where she turns to Kyle Dressler now and lets him have it, where the camera lingers on his face while she says something cutting, where the whole thing pays off as revenge. That is not what happened, because that is not who she was, and because the people who have actually been the underestimated one know that gloating is a thing you only want when you still need the room's approval, and Maggie Hale had stopped needing the room's approval in a tent a long time ago. She did not look at Kyle Dressler at all. She did not need to. The salute had done to him what no words of hers could have done, and she knew it, and she let it be enough, and she turned back to her patient. But Kyle Dressler walked over to her anyway, because he was a better man at 5 o'clock than he had been at 4, and he stood next to her while she worked, and he said, low, just to her, "I'm sorry. I waved you off. I'm so sorry." And Maggie Hale, not looking up from the man in the cab, said the thing she would have said to any of her young medics, the thing that was its own kind of forgiveness and its own kind of lesson. You saw a gray-haired lady in a barn coat, and you made a call with the information you had. That's not the sin. The sin is not changing the call when the information changes. You changed it. You changed it fast, and you spent the next half hour being the best set of hands I had. So we're square. Now hold his head while I check his pupils. And Kyle Dressler held the man's head, and his eyes were wet, and he was square with her, and he would be a different paramedic for the rest of his career, because of one afternoon when a stranger he had insulted refused to make him pay for it. It is worth staying a moment with what that did to Kyle, because the story owes him the truth. He had walked onto that scene the most certain person on it, and he walked off it having learned, in the space of 40 minutes, the size of what he did not know, and the shape of the kind of competence that does not wear a uniform or announce itself or ask permission. And the gift of it, the thing he would be grateful for until he was an old man, was that she had not made him feel small for it. She had handed him a job and trusted him with it and corrected him without shaming him and squared it with him at the end. And in doing so, she had taught him not just how to run a scene, but how to be the kind of person who could run one, which is a different and a harder thing, and which most people never learn because most people who could teach it are too busy being right at you to bother. The cleanup of a scene like that takes a long time, longer than the crisis, and Maggie stayed for the length of it because she was not the kind of person who does the hard part and leaves before the boring part. She gave her report to the next cruise. She helped load the last of the walking wounded. She found Dana Boyd a blanket and crouched by her one more time and checked the tourniquet and told her, "You did good. You paid the price and you kept your nerve. Most people can't. You're going to be fine, and in about a week your arm is going to hurt like the devil, and that's the arm telling you it's still attached. You earned it." And Dana Boyd, who would spend months trying to find out who the woman in the olive jacket was and would eventually track her down to thank her, and would be met with a plate of cookies and a complete refusal to discuss it, held onto Maggie's hand and would not let go for a minute, and Maggie let her hold it, because sometimes the holding is the medicine, and then she gently took her hand back, because there was paperwork now, and a trooper who needed a statement, and the long, slow descent of a body coming down off the thing it does in a crisis, which Maggie knew was coming for her and knew she would have to ride out alone, later, at home, with the dog, the way she always did, but she had not, even now, put down the cold question she had picked up in the median and set on the shelf, and while the official people worked the official chaos, she went and took it back down and started with the driver. He had survived, banged up and shaking, a blanket on his shoulders, and Maggie Hale sat down next to him in her barn coat, looking like exactly what they had all thought she was, a kind woman, just a bystander, and she asked him gently how he was holding up, and got him talking the way she had gotten frightened soldiers talking for years. She did not interrogate him. That was the art of it. She made herself small and kind and safe, and she let the silences do the work, and the man, who had been bracing all afternoon for someone to accuse him, found instead a gentle gray-haired woman who seemed to be on his side, and he told her things because people tell the truth to the person who is not threatening them. He told her, without meaning to, that he had been awake for a very long time. He told her about the electronic logbook, the one that is supposed to make cheating impossible, and the way the dispatcher had shown him to make the log say one thing while the truck did another, and how everyone on the line did it, and how if you did not, you did not keep the route. He told her the brakes had been making a noise for a couple of weeks, and that he had written it up twice and nothing had happened because a truck in the shop is a truck not making money. He thought he was talking to a nice lady. He was talking to a woman who had spent 3 years learning that a disaster is the visible end of a long, invisible chain of small decisions, and who was, even as she nodded, building the chain backward in her mind from the wreck on the road to the choice in an office that had made the wreck inevitable. Because that was the thing Maggie Hale understood that almost no one on that shoulder did. The cocky young paramedic was never the story. He was a loud man in front of a quiet machine, and the machine was the real thing. The freight company had been running its loaded trucks down the direct interstate instead of the slower designated route, shaving 11 minutes off every run, and 11 minutes a run across a whole fleet across a whole year is a number with a lot of zeros on it. And the way you make 11 minutes pay is you push the drivers past their legal hours and paper it over with a logbook trick, and you skip the brake services that take a truck off the road. Nobody at that company had decided to send 40 tons through stopped traffic and nearly kill 7 people. They had decided over and over in small meetings to save 11 minutes, and the wreck was just the place where all those small decisions finally arrived at a human body. And here is the part that made it a crime and not only a tragedy. The company knew. There had been a safety man, a quiet, conscientious man whose job was to catch exactly this, who had flagged the routing and the hours and the maintenance backlog in a memo 9 months before the crash, and whose memo had been received and acknowledged and filed and buried because acting on it cost money, and the safety man had been thanked for his diligence and quietly moved to a role where he could not see the trucks anymore. That memo existed. Somewhere in that company there was a piece of paper written by a frightened, honest man that named the whole disaster 9 months before it happened, and the only person positioned to make sure that piece of paper saw daylight was a woman in a barn coat that the responders had spent the afternoon underestimating. She did not solve it that day because that is not how it works, and the story is going to be honest about how it works. She gave her statement to Ray Okonkwo, calm and complete and precise, every observation in order, the marks on the road and the lack of them, the driver's exhaustion, the noise the brakes had been making, the things the driver had said, and she gave it in the flat credentialed shorthand of a person who has written a great many incident reports. And then she did the most characteristic thing she did all day, which was to ask him to leave her name out of it, not the statement, the story. Put what I saw in your report, she told him. I'll testify to every word of it, under oath all day long, but keep me out of the rest. No reporters, no hero bystander. The second this becomes a story about the mystery woman who saved the day, it stops being about the brakes and the hours and the memo, and those are the only things that keep this from happening to the next 6 cars. Keep them in it. Leave me out of it. And Ray Okonkwo, who wanted nothing more than to tell every person he had ever met what this woman had done, understood that she was right and gave her his word and kept it. The investigation took the better part of a year, and it ended real but not clean, because justice is real but rarely clean, and the story will not pretend otherwise. There were fines, large enough to make the news, and small enough that the company paid them and went on existing. A manager retired with a package. The dispatcher was let go and was driving for a different company within the year. Nobody went to prison because the chain of small decisions was exactly diffuse enough that no single person had done a single thing a prosecutor could call a crime, which is precisely how machines protect themselves, by spreading the responsibility so thin that it evaporates. Maggie Hale did not bring down an empire. She was never going to. One person almost never does. But here is what she did do, and it is not nothing, and the story insists that you sit with it, because the meaning of a life like hers is in the not nothing. Because she testified, and because Ray Okonkwo pulled the thread, the memo came out. The frightened, honest safety man was subpoenaed, and under oath, with his hand on a book, he told the truth about the memo he had written 9 months before the crash, and once it was in the record, it could not be unrecorded. A reporter who actually cared got hold of it, and it became the kind of small, persistent story that does not bring down a company, but does change an industry at the edges, the kind that gets cited in a hearing 2 years later when the rules get tightened. The routing restriction on that stretch of interstate got enforced for real, with cameras and fines that meant it. The logbook loophole got closed in the next round of regulation, partly on the strength of a memo. A woman in a barn coat made sure could not stay buried. Walter Pruitt lived. Dana Boyd kept her arm. The man in the cab, whose name was Tom, went home to his kids. 7 people who would have been a different kind of statistic were instead just people who had a bad Tuesday. And an industry was, by a few degrees, made less likely to do it again, and all of it traced back, through a year of hearings and a buried memo and a young trooper's report, to a woman standing in tall grass in the middle of a catastrophe, doing arithmetic, hearing the quiet alarm, and refusing to look away from the question of why. When the company's lawyer tried in the deposition to suggest that a civilian's observations of skid marks and brake noise were not reliable, were just a bystander's impressions, Maggie Hale looked at him with those level gray-green eyes and said without any heat at all, "I spent the better part of 3 years reading scenes that would have killed me if I read them wrong. You don't need my impressions. The skid marks were on the road until the rain, and the brake write-ups are in your client's own system with dates on them, and the driver said what he said in front of a paramedic and a trooper. You need the dates." And the lawyer moved on, because there is nothing to do with a witness like that except get her off the stand as fast as you can, and Maggie answered the rest and signed the transcript and drove home and let the dog out and did not tell a single soul in her town what she had done. The road went back to being a road. The wrecks were towed, Hector Salas hooking up the last of them himself, working in silence next to a woman he now understood he had badly underestimated for the 2 years he had known her as the lady who sold eggs. And when the last car was on the truck, he had come to her and not known what to say, and finally just said, "Where'd you serve?" the way one soldier asks another, and Maggie had told him, "The unit, the years, not the night, never the night," and Hector had nodded slowly and said, "I knew it. The second you talked, I knew it." And that had been the whole conversation, and it had been enough. And after that, Hector Salas brought her diesel for her tractor at cost and never said why. And they were, in the wordless way of people who have recognized each other, friends for the rest of their lives. The traffic started moving. The sun went down the sky toward evening, and Maggie Hale got back in her truck, with the fence staples still in the bed and the coffee still cold in the cup holder, and she drove home, and the thing she had been holding off all afternoon came down on her on the drive the way it always came down on her, the shaking, the after, the body finally allowed to feel what it had set aside, and she pulled over once on a quiet country road and put her hands flat on the wheel and let them shake for a while where no one could see, the way she had in the back of the rig in the city all those years ago. And then it passed, the way it always passed, and she wiped her face and put the truck back in gear and drove the rest of the way home to the chickens and the dog and the porch that needed paint. Ray Okonkwo came to see her once, at the end of all of it, after the hearings, after the memo, after the rules got changed at the edges. He drove out to her place on a Sunday in his own truck, in civilian clothes, and he stood on her porch that needed paint, and she gave him coffee, and they sat, and for a while they did not talk about any of it. And then he said the thing he had driven out to say, which was, "I never thanked you," that night. I was 19, and I was unconscious for most of it, and then I was in a hospital, and then I was home, and by the time I had the words "you were gone," nobody knew where, and I have spent 11 years not knowing if you were even alive, and then I walked up on that wreck, and there you were, kneeling over some guy in a truck doing the exact thing you did to me, and I have to tell you, Sergeant, I have to say it out loud once or I'll never sleep right. Thank you. You gave me everything. Every day I have had since I was 19, my wife, my kids, this whole life, I have it because you knelt on my leg in the dark and would not let me quit. Thank you." And Maggie Hale, who did not get thanked, who had spent a career making sure the thanks went nowhere it could find her, looked at the man on her porch and did not deflect it this time, did not change the subject because Carol Tanner had taught her something about letting people give you the thing they need to give you, and she said simply, "You're welcome, Ray. You were worth it. You were always going to be worth it. I knew it that night. That's why I wouldn't let you go." And Ray Okonkwo put his face in his hands on the porch of a woman who sold eggs and wept, and Maggie Hale put her hand on his shoulder and let him, and the chickens scratched in the yard, and the dog slept in the sun, and the ordinary indifferent evening went on all around the two of them, a trooper and the sergeant who saved him, 11 years and 1,000 miles from the dark where she had told him about a bird. He changed how he was around her, completely and forever after that. He did not tell the town the whole story because he understood she did not want it told, and because some things between two people who have been to the bottom of the same dark together do not belong to a town. But he started coming by. He brought his family out to see the chickens, his wife, who Maggie liked immediately, and he started, quietly, a thing in the county, a once-a-year thing, in the early summer around the anniversary of the wreck, where the volunteer fire crews and the EMS services and the troopers ran a real mass casualty drill, a good one, the kind that would actually work, the kind Maggie designed because she had taught the county the hardest possible way that the worst thing can come up the interstate on an ordinary Tuesday, and that the time to be ready is before, not during. And every year at that drill, the first thing they teach the new people, the thing Ray Okonkwo says at the front with the whole crew listening, is the thing the woman in the barn coat taught a cocky young paramedic on the shoulder of a road. The quiet ones are the dying ones, and the most dangerous person you will ever meet at a scene is the calm one who already knows what to do, and you had better learn to tell the difference between the loud, certain person and the quiet, competent one, because someday it is going to be the whole game. They do not say her name. She does not want it said, but the whole drill is her. Every word of it, the lesson she taught in 90 seconds, passed on now to rooms full of responders who will never know they are learning it from a woman who sells eggs. Kyle Dressler became a different paramedic. He tracked her down, the way Dana Boyd did, the way a few of them did, and he drove out to her place to thank her, and she gave him cookies and refused to discuss it, the way she refused to discuss it with all of them, but Kyle was persistent in the way of a young man who has had his whole understanding of himself rearranged, and he kept coming back, and eventually Maggie let him sit on the porch, and over a couple of years she taught him things, not formally, never formally, just in the way she answered his questions when he brought them, and Kyle Dressler became, in his department, the medic the others learned from, the one who could read a quiet patient, the one who taught the new hires that the screaming ones are breathing and the silent ones are the danger, and he never told them where he learned it, and once a year he showed up at Maggie's drill and ran it like the best junior medic she had, the way he had on the worst and best day of his life, and he was, because of one afternoon, when a stranger he had insulted refused to make him pay, a man who would spend his whole career being the reason quiet patients did not slip away. He still does not quite know how to thank her. She does not want to be thanked. They have made their peace with that. There was one more thing, and I will end with it, because Maggie would. A while after the hearings, a package came to her place, a small one, no return address, and inside it was a coin. Not a sparrow, a different unit, a different bird, a coin Maggie did not recognize, and a note in a careful hand, and the note was from the safety man, the frightened, honest man who had written the memo 9 months before the crash and watched it get buried, and the note said only, "They tried to bury what I wrote. You dug it back up. I don't have the words. I carried this for 20 years, and I want you to have it from one person who tried to warn somebody to another who finally got listened to." And Maggie Hale held a third coin in her hand, a stranger's coin, the coin of a man who had tried to do the right thing inside a machine and been quietly moved where he could not see, and who had gotten, at the end, because of her, the one thing the machine had denied him, which was to be heard. And she put his coin in a drawer where she kept the things that mattered, next to the badge she still did not wear, and she understood that the not-nothing she had done had reached a man she never met and given him back a piece of his own dignity, and that this, too, was part of what a life like hers was for. She still sells eggs. She is 54 years old, and she lives at the edge of a small town in a house with a porch that finally got painted, because Ray Okonkwo and Kyle Dressler showed up one Saturday with brushes and would not take no for an answer. And she keeps chickens and a dog and a garden, and to the daily texture of that town she is mostly, even now, just the quiet woman with the eggs, which is still, even after everything, exactly how she wants it. The difference is small, and it is everything. Now there are a handful of people in the world who know what she is, and they leave her be about it, which is its own kind of love, and once a year a county full of responders gets a little better at saving lives because of a lesson nobody will tell them the source of. And on the hard days, the anniversary days, Maggie Hale takes the 2 coins out of her pocket, West Tanner's and her own, the bird and the bird, and she sets them on the windowsill in the morning sun. The sparrow faces out, and she lets them sit there all day. A small private ritual that means I am still standing in front of them, and the ones I kept are still here, and the one I lost is not forgotten, and at evening she puts them back in her pocket and goes out to shut the chickens in, and she does the next necessary thing, and the next, the way she always has, the way she always will, a woman the world decided didn't count, who never once needed it to be right. Some people spend their whole lives making sure the world knows exactly how much they matter. They collect the titles and the uniforms and the loud authority, and they mistake all of it for the thing it is supposed to stand in for, which is the simple, rare, terrifying ability to be the one who knows what to do when the floor falls out from under everyone. And some people learn that ability in a place that costs them everything, and then carry it home folded behind a license where no one will look, and stand quietly at the edge of the world's worst afternoons, asking for nothing, waving off no thanks they can avoid, until the one Tuesday the worst thing comes up the road, and the only thing between a stranger and a death no one else can even name is the person the scene decided didn't count. So I will leave you with the question Maggie Hale's whole life asks, and I would genuinely like your answer, because how you answer it says something about you. When that afternoon comes for the people you love, and someday, in some form, it will, would you rather be the loudest, most certain person on the scene, the one in the uniform everyone steps back for, sure of yourself right up until the floor gives way and you freeze? Or would you rather be the quiet one at the edge that everybody waved off, the one with the worn coin in her pocket and the 2 birds and the steady hands, the one who already knows how to keep going through the wind?